Well, let me go back a little bit and talk about some history before World War II, because that's also extremely revealing. Here I'll just barely mention some things, but suggest you look at them. If you go back to the 18th century, the differences between today's first world and today's third world were much less sharp than they are now. For example, India was the major commercial industrial center of the world in the 18th century. It was producing more iron than all of Europe, and high tech too. And as late as the 1820s, English engineers were going to India to learn how to make advanced steelmaking techniques and that sort of thing. In fact, it seems from recent scholarship that wages in South Indian industry were actually higher than in English industry in those years in purchasing power, and working conditions were in fact better. It wasn't that they were producing because they had cheaper labor, as had often been thought, apparently. And that's just one dramatic example. I mean, obviously that's not the relation between India and England today. And the pattern is general throughout the first and third world. So that raises a couple of questions. One question is, which countries developed and which countries didn't? And the second question is, can we sort out some of the factors? Well, the answer to the first question is completely straightforward. We don't have to waste any time on it. The countries that developed were Europe and those who resisted European colonization. That means basically two: the United States, which did resist European colonization, and Japan, which was able to keep from being colonized. So they developed. Japan brought along a couple of its colonies in tow, what are now South Korea and Taiwan. Japan was a brutal colonial ruler, but it treated its colonies differently from the West. It developed them. So if you look at the development of Taiwan and was in Formosa and Korea, under Japanese imperial rule, it's about the same as Japan, in every respect. It's just different from the West. So that's the part of the world that developed, not much else. Leads to the question of what the factors were. Well, some of the reasons are pretty clear and well known and not argued about very much. They're summarized, for example, in a major review of the topic by a well-known, quite conservative economic historian, Paul Roche, in a book published by Chicago University Press recently. He points out the consensus that there is no doubt that the Third World's compulsory economic liberalism was a major element in explaining the delay in its industrialization, and in the very revealing case of India, the process, I'm quoting, the process of deindustrialization that turned the world's leading workshop and trading center into a deeply impoverished agricultural society with a very sharp decline in real wages, in food consumption, and availability of simple commodities, and so on. Notice that that's neoliberalism for the defenseless. That's the current Washington consensus, the doctrine we're supposed to worship for the defenseless, not for us. What about the successful societies? Well, actually here it isn't really well understood. So about 2/3 of U.S. growth in per capita output is unexplained, so specialists tell us. But some things are reasonably clear. One of them is that radical departure from free market principles was a significant factor, maybe decisive. As far as I know, that holds without exception from England up to the East Asian growth area today, dramatically, including the United States. So let's take us. How come we aren't still pursuing our comparative advantage in, say, exporting fur, which is what the principles tell us we should be doing? Well, like how come, say, we have a textile industry? Industrial revolution begins with textiles. Was it, say, that the textiles produced in eastern Massachusetts in the 1820s and 30s were cheaper and better than the textiles in England? No, it wasn't. They were worse and more expensive. But the United States had liberated itself and therefore was able to set up very high protectionist barriers and keep out the cheaper and better textiles from England. In other words, doing exactly what England had done to India. That's how it developed its own textile industry. And the result was that a textile industry developed in eastern Massachusetts with a lot of side effects. I mean, that means machinery and carpentry and woodworking and all kind of things that grew up around the textile industry. Well, go on in the century. What about steel? How did the United States develop a steel industry? Was U.S. steel cheaper or better? No, it was worse. British steel was cheaper and better, but the United States set up very high protectionist barriers and also used the military system. So the great pacifist Andrew Carnegie was able to overlook his principles enough to get big naval contracts and, of course, to use state force to smash workers trying to strike and get wages and to hide behind high protectionist walls, and was able to set up U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation, and we got a steel industry. And so the story continues right until 1945. As Baruch puts it, the United States was the mother country and bastion of modern protectionism up to 1945. Again, the professional disciplines are designed in such a way that they don't really explain what was happening. They radically underestimate the role of the state in industrialization. And you can see this if you think about it a little bit. So protectionism was one factor, and that's the factor studied by economic historians overwhelmingly. But it wasn't the only factor. So the Industrial Revolution depended on cheap cotton, both in England and the United States. How was cotton made cheap and available? Like, was it market principles? No. It was by extermination of the native population in the southeast part of the United States and bringing in of slaves. Those are fairly serious violations of the market, but somehow that doesn't enter into the discussion when we talk about economic development and the marvels of the free market. Or take, say, the annexation of Texas and the takeover of a third of Mexico. What was the point of that? Well, we know, but that's studied in some other discipline, American history. The Jacksonian Democrats who carried this out were hoping to gain a world monopoly of cotton. President Tyler put it, if we annex Texas, it will place all other nations at our feet. In particular, it will place England at our feet, and remember, England was the great enemy because of its military force, which was constraining U.S. expansion. The Polk administration, with this having been achieved, said that the United States could now control the commerce of the world. It could command the trade of the world with inappreciable political and commercial advantages because of the fact that the United States, they hoped, had a virtual monopoly of the major commodity in world trade, namely cotton. Notice that the reasoning of the Jacksonian Democrats is exactly what was attributed to the Beast of Baghdad a couple of years ago. He was going to take control of the world's leading commodity and bring all nations to his feet, and so on and so forth. In that case, it was a fantasy, but a century and a half earlier, it was no fantasy, and it was a very significant part of how U.S. industrial development took place. Again, not exactly by market principles. A contemporary analog to that, in fact, is the energy industry. A very substantial part of the Pentagon budget is aimed at the Middle East, and its goal is to keep energy prices within a certain range. Not too high, because that'll harm the Western economies, not too low, because that'll cut into the profits of the energy corporations, which are mostly U.S. and partially British. So it's got to be kept in a range. There hasn't been much study of this. The only technical study I know is by an Energy Department consultant who concludes that the price of oil is underestimated by about 30% because of failure to calculate the part of the Pentagon budget that goes into keeping it that way. If that figure is anywhere near accurate, it means that the alleged efficiencies of trade are wildly off. They're way more, it's really way more expensive than is assumed, with all kind of other consequences about the economy. But again, this isn't the kind of topic you study if you want to get a job and that sort of thing. Well, as I say, factors like that are just not considered in economic history, past or present, and that leads to a very significant underestimation of the role of state intervention. Well, back in the 19th century, there were other cotton producers, not just the United States. India and Egypt were two major ones. India, you don't have to worry about. The British had smashed that one. What about Egypt? It's kind of hard to remember now, but in the early 19th century, Egypt was looked at as a potential powerhouse. Had a big, rich agricultural country. It was beginning its industrial development. It was barred. The British refused to allow independent development in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they had the power to block it. Foreign Minister Palmerston put it pretty bluntly. He said, "No ideas of fairness to Egypt ought to stand in the way of such great and paramount interests of Britain as maintaining a monopoly in that region." And they had the power to block it, so Egypt became what it is. Industrial development terminated. The United States, in contrast, which was, you could realistically compare to Egypt in those days and to India, the United States was able to follow the path of state-guided development, just like the mother country did, and it became what it is, rich industrial country. Later, Japan and its colonies did the same. Now, England did turn to liberal internationalism, to free trade, in 1846. That was after 150 years of protectionism and violence, and in fact the organization of Europe's most efficient developmental state with high taxation and so on. After all of that had led to double the per capita capitalization of any competitor. At that point, and other competitors like India were destroyed, so being way ahead of any competitor, the British discovered the wonders of a level playing field and went to liberal internationalism. You learn about that in school and how wonderful it was. However, there were some significant reservations. 40% of British textiles went to colonized India, and that was true of British exports pretty generally. Steel was later on British steel was priced out of international markets, but the colonies were still available, so you could send it to them in accordance with the principles of free trade. By the 1920s, Britain simply couldn't compete with Japan, which was more efficient and so on, so they just called the game off. The empire was closed to Japanese imports. That's a large part of the background for World War II. The Indian manufacturers did plead for protection, but from England, not from Japan, and that's not the way the game is played. In brief, the free trade game is fine if you're going to win. If that sounds familiar, it is. It's universal. So let's look at the United States. A century after England, the United States followed the same course, namely in 1945, again after 150 years of violence and radical market interference. The United States was far ahead of any competitor, in fact had half the world's wealth at the time. So again, like in England a century earlier, a level playing field looked like a nice idea if you're going to smash everybody, but again with reservations. So other countries were permitted only what was called complementary development, not the kind that would interfere with U.S. interests. That was true for Brazil, for Egypt, for India, and on and on. So like Brazil could have steel plants, but not high-tech steel of the kind we were producing. They could produce the low-end steel that we didn't care about. And we had the power to enforce that.